we answer Reload members' questions on the NRA Annual Meeting and the fallout from recent mass shootings. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can check out our membership options today if you want to support sane, sober, serious firearms journalism, and you want to get exclusive access to hundreds, I believe, maybe at this point, of pieces of content, reports, analysis pieces, so you can keep up with the latest on what's happening in the gun world. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. This is a special question and answer episode of the podcast. I've got contributing writer Jake Fogelman here with me today. How are you doing, Jake?
I'm doing well, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing okay. It's been obviously a very hard week for everyone in the country, I would imagine, after this horrific massacre at an elementary school in Texas, which left 19 students killed and 2 teachers. It's one of the worst attacks on a school in American history. And so we're going to be talking in part about the fallout from that, what can be done, to prevent these sorts of events in the future, what sort of policies are going to be pursued, that kind of thing. And we've gotten several questions about that. And then obviously it's been it was already going to be a busy week for guns in America, as you had the ATF nomination. The confirmation for President Biden's ATF nominee happened on Wednesday, and the NRA Annual Meeting is going to be happening over the Memorial Day weekend in Houston. So we've got a bunch of questions from members. This is another perk of being a member of the Reload, is you actually get to ask the questions in these episodes. You can also come on the show if that's something that interests you. If you're a member, one of my favorite segments is when we have a Reload member on. But why don't we start here with the first question? We've got one from Edward McNeely, who's a Reload member, and he says, "How can I, as a gun owner, engage with those friends of mine who feel such grief and anger over events like Buffalo and Uvalde? There seems to be a general thrust that as a gun owner, I'm somehow complicit in this. Is there any way to empathetically respond to these accusations or insinuations, or is the best response not to engage at all? I worry I cede ground in the public debate by not engaging, but am I only making things worse if I do?" So I think that speaks to a feeling that a lot of gun owners get in the aftermath of these shootings. I know certainly I do, where you're not only taking in the horror of what happened, but also you're essentially being accused of being in cahoots with the murderer, or being associated with him, or being, wanting these things to happen. Like, this is clearly something that is insinuated or directly said, even by our president, honestly. That was basically President Biden's accusation. And it is hard, right? That's hard to deal with on top of what's already a horrific situation. You've even seen some of the parents being attacked on social media for their views on guns. Parents who just lost an elementary school child being attacked because of their political beliefs on firearms, as though gun owners want these things to happen or don't care that they do.
Right.
So I think that really gets at one of the things, what it's like to be a gun owner or a gun rights advocate in the wake of a horrible shooting like this. But what do you think, Jake? What's the right response?
Well, one thing for sure, as you said, that I totally agree with you. And this is a very relatable phenomenon for a lot of gun owners. I think as soon as you see the massive public, which is an understandable outcry because it is such a horrific incident that no one likes to see. But you feel this impending sense that I'm going to be somehow lumped in with this madman that just committed this horrible crime. So the first thing I would say to the gun owners out there that feel this type of thing is most of us understand. The best thing you can do is just please be a good ambassador for gun ownership. I know a lot of people, obviously no one likes to be put on the defensive with such horrible insinuations or accusations. But you really have to avoid some of the things that you sometimes see out there where gun owners get very defensive and I don't know what the right word would be, but basically talk down to people that, I don't know, you're getting the facts wrong, or how dare you, or you're not going to get my guns. I don't care how emotional you get. That's so counterproductive in situations like these. I know it can be hard to not be fired up when someone makes horrible insinuations about you as a person that's done nothing wrong. But it's just so important to be a good ambassador, especially in moments like these, because it will only make it worse if you're seen as the heartless gun owner who's just going to own the people that are trying or grappling with a horrible incident like this.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point to make. Emotions run high on both sides of the issue, and in the wake of these, and you will get people who say terrible things on the other side as well. So yeah, don't react. Try not to react that way. I would say as far as engaging, I probably would pick and choose the right moments to engage. If there's actually something productive to come out of a conversation with somebody, like, it's, for me, how I approach this is, one, I'm not running out there trying to make political points, immediately. I just find that very distasteful. I can understand why that happens on either side, especially in our current political climate, which is very polarized. And there's a rush by gun control advocates to try and capitalize on what's happened, not necessarily because they are cruel or whatever. They honestly believe in their solutions. They honestly believe that's how you would stop these things from happening. And they also understand the political reality of how reactions to mass shootings go, which is that there's an immediate surge in support for passing new gun control policies, which then wanes over time. So they have become accustomed to trying to take advantage of that immediately, even if it's, Senator Murphy was quite literally on the floor before, we even knew what had actually happened. And that's the reason why, because he genuinely believes that what he wants to do will help, not just because he's a politician. So, but anyway, I think it's important to pick your conversations here, try and find areas where it's useful to say something. Don't try to dunk on other people.
Yeah.
You could probably have some headway by just being calm and understanding towards the person that you're talking with. Obviously, if you're, if you know the person, it can be easier to do that, or it could even be harder to do that, of course.
Yeah, sometimes,
depending on the circumstances, how personal the attacks are. But if you don't know the person, if it's some sort of public debate, then it's, engaging with somebody who is clearly not making any sort of good faith argument is not likely to help anyone. I think, certainly you don't necessarily want to, as Edward was saying, like, you don't want to just cede all of the conversation to people operating in bad faith. So you want to be able to have rational conversations and give your honest position on why you own guns, why you view guns as a net positive instead of a net negative for society, how you might solve these problems. I think we'll probably get into this more. There's obviously more questions that are going to be related to these mass shootings, but not any one policy is going to solve any of this. Is one thing I would keep in mind when you're making arguments, when you're discussing these events, like, because the common thing to do on both sides is to just say that, like the president did, that now he did admit that it wouldn't solve everything, but he's putting up assault weapons bans as though they would, be the solution to this nearly on their own. And then you have, of course, Ted Cruz and other Republicans are pointing to added school safety, like single entry points or man traps, like you have in a jewelry store or something, a pawn shop. But it's not to say that either of those things couldn't have an impact in theory, but they get treated as though they're obviously the only thing or the right thing, the magic switch that's going to fix everything, and that's just not reality. And so try to stay away from those kinds of absolutist arguments is what I would encourage, because they basically just play to people who already agree with you anyway.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It may not be the most satisfying answer, but you really just have to kind of pick your battles in the aftermath of these events. Just engage when you think there's good faith and when you can appeal to one another's humanity, which I know can be tricky in our modern times and on social media when that doesn't seem to exist always. But I think it does more harm than good when you try to engage with someone that is operating in bad faith. It's just counterproductive at that point.
And I would say engaging in social media fights is almost never productive, right? Regardless of the circumstances. We all do it, I'm sure, from time to time. Certainly I've done it myself, and there's a strong draw to do that. But it's generally not going to help anyone. And, if you want to put your message out there, that's one thing. Try to be respectful and put your message out through social media without intentionally fighting other people. That's one way you could at least share your point of view without being combative or aggressive about it. That'll probably give you more likelihood of success in convincing people of your position at the very least. But what's the next question we got? Yeah,
so it's similar, obviously on a related subject from Reload member Kevin DeWalt. He asks, what can the gun community, and he specifies not the government, but the gun community, begin doing to mitigate the potential of these horrific massacres? There's a lot of worthwhile energy put into pointing out why some legislation won't work, but unless the gun rights community starts proposing next steps and not vague solutions, the gun control advocates will continue to claim the moral high ground. So he's basically asking how can gun owners be proactive so they're not constantly feeling like they're on the defensive in the aftermath of these shootings, which I think is a great question. It's obviously something I think a lot of people consider. And I think it is important for the gun community to at least have their own ideas. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's going to be as quick and easy as like a panacea policy solution that you sometimes see on the other side. But I think even something like a see something, say something model where you're very proactive, and obviously, time after time after time with these shootings, it comes out that, there was this incident that happened beforehand and this incident that happened beforehand. He liked guns, but he also had some weird behavioral problems, and he was starting to lash out, and he was starting to, have some angry outbursts, and he had some run-ins with police. And so one quick thing you can do, not just as a gun owner, but just as a private citizen that might be listening, is sort of a see something, say something model. Just be proactive ahead of these things, because obviously time after time we see there's a lot of red flag indicators that there might be something that's going to happen in these incidents. So,
yeah, I think that's one area where you probably see a lot of agreements among gun owners, which is to more effectively use current law to try and intervene with these potential shooters, as you just mentioned there. Obviously there's still vigorous debate over red flag laws in particular.
Sure.
the extreme risk protection orders, and whether or not those are good policy is something that is still debated among most gun owners. There's obviously significant support. You have people like David French. You've even had the National Rifle Association and Republican senators in theory supporting the concept of red flag laws, but there's been a lot of dispute over how they've been drafted in practice in many blue states, with concerns over, how the process is initiated, who can actually file for a red flag order. Some states it's much broader than others. Generally speaking, it's family members or police or mental health professionals or school officials, which probably is something that a lot of people would agree on with those standards. But some are looser than that, and
right.
People worry about abuse of the system, there not being enough safeguards,
Sure.
or if somebody files a false red flag order against you, there's concerns over. Obviously these are temporary orders, so they're held to a lower standard of evidence than something like involuntary commitment,
Right.
Potentially, or at least the process is easier for a red flag order than it is for involuntary commitment. And then there's concerns over the fact that it's a lower evidentiary process, and
right.
It affects a constitutional right, of course, but as David, we just had a whole episode on the podcast about this last week, about red flag laws, and David French made his case, which is a strong case. There's strong counterpoints to it, but we have similar restraining orders for domestic violence incidents as well.
Right.
And then there's obviously the critique that all red flag orders do is take away somebody's guns. It doesn't necessarily make them less dangerous. It doesn't mitigate all of the risks they pose. But I would feel like, I don't know. I guess I'm getting on one specific policy question here.
Right.
That's I'll try to give a couple more after this. But my feeling is that you could mitigate a lot of these concerns, and perhaps that's something that Democrats and Republicans should be able to find solutions for. These concerns seem like ones that are addressable to me, while the policy seems, clear in how it at least could be utilized to stop mass shootings. Again, this is another area where it's easy to say, well, just pass red flag laws, but they're not a foolproof solution all the time either. Buffalo shooting happened, even though he very clearly should have been red flagged.
Right.
He was evaluated, but released without any further action taken against him. And then he went on to buy his gun and commit a shooting. He may have, even if he had been red flagged, he may have been able to obtain a gun illegally. Anyway, that's another critique, of course, but I don't see any reason why we shouldn't make it harder for someone with those explicit warning signs based on things they have actually done and there's evidence of. But as far as what else can gun owners in particular do to address mass shootings, or how to put forward policies to help prevent mass shootings? I mean, there's being proactive in your community is obviously one thing where, if you know somebody who's having mental health struggles, like you said, there are avenues to, one, get them help, but also ensure that they're not a threat to other people. That could involve calling the police if there's a serious enough threat involved. I think, again, I don't think any of this is going to be some foolproof thing that's always going to prevent every shooting, because it's not easy to necessarily pick the handful of people out of 340 million who are going to, whose acting out is going to end in a mass killing event, right?
Right.
But yeah, I think proactivity, actually trying to follow through on somebody who's exhibiting the kind of warning signs, this, because you're right, we hear about it all the time with these cases where somebody does this and it turns out that there were a lot of warning signs and maybe they weren't acted on or weren't put together into a pattern by anyone.
Right.
And nothing was done and they end up having no disqualifying criminal record when they go to buy their guns, even if they had a number of incidents that, had they been taken to the fruition of a prosecution or a commitment, the person would not have been able to legally buy guns. But yeah, I mean, I think there's also a good point in there about if there's no coherent response from the gun rights community for these events, then it does it does make it seem as though the only people offering real solutions are the gun control advocates. And so that is a real danger, I think, in the public perception. You have to come up with solutions that are actually going to have an impact, and be able to explain why things like total categorical bans on types of guns aren't going to be a successful intervention. Which again, you can, just as rider flag laws were not used in the New York shooting, there is an assault weapons ban in New York, and he bought a New York legal AR and then modified it illegally. So,
right.
Obviously those solutions aren't panaceas either.
Right. And just, another thing similar to being proactive doesn't necessarily even have to do with guns or involving, red flag orders. Right. It's just a lot of these folks are people that live in communities where people are aware of these people in the communities. They realize that they're sometimes ostracized and lonely. And sometimes, just be a good neighbor, reach out to people, just person to person type stuff. You don't even have to involve the gun necessarily. Just be aware, notice if people in your orbit are seeming like they're in crisis, do what you can to reach out. A lot of that stuff could be helpful as well. Again, not a panacea, but it's better than not doing anything.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, that is one problem with the framing of the question, I guess, is like, what are gun owners supposed to do? Well, it's not just gun owners. I understand what he means, of course, but yeah, I mean, like you look at a lot of these shooters and it's clear that they had very little support from their community or their families were, they come from broken families where things were not going well. The shooter's mother there's reports about drug use and no reports about his father. There's all reports about bullying and, poor relations with other people. These are common things that you hear, which are sort of a societal level issue. Of course, not everyone who, again, these are like, not everyone who's had a rough childhood or a bad family situation is going to, certainly the vast majority of people like that are not going to end up being mass shooters. But yes, I mean, taking a societal health approach towards the situation is legitimate as well, even if, again, it's not some scalpel-like, precision to addressing the issue of particular mass shooters. But, I don't think it's illegitimate to talk about the broken backgrounds of people who often end up carrying out these sorts of attacks.
Sure.
As being a contributing factor, and one that is not a specific policy suggestion, but is more of a cultural or societal solution.
Right.
But anyway, it's amazing when you do a podcast or TV or whatever, how you can go from like having no issues and talking perfectly, and then the more you talk, the more you have to cough and
Oh yeah.
It's always like that. But I'll give the next question here. This one comes from Doug Jefferson, who's the vice president of the National African American Gun Association. And he asks, what efforts, if any, have you seen regarding strengthening enforcement of current laws and processes that could prevent tragedies like what occurred in Buffalo? For example, in both Charleston and San Antonio church shootings, the assailants were able to legally purchase firearms because disqualifying factors had not been properly reported, resulting in charges not showing up on their background checks. Right. So this goes hand in hand with what we were just talking about, right?
Right.
One of the things that's key in these situations is that, like, you can talk about red flag laws and we can debate the drawbacks and the positives of them, and you could make a case for how they should have been employed in, at the very least, the Buffalo shooting, potentially the elementary school shooting, given there were reports that he was cutting himself and was, had domestic violence threats and, some other warning signs for this attack. But the bottom line is, if nobody does anything about that, it doesn't really matter what laws you have in place.
Right.
Right. So the key here is people have to be willing to actually say something and actually file, police have to be willing to file charges. But of course, there's drawbacks to that approach too, because oftentimes the reason you wouldn't get serious charges is because the idea is to not ruin someone's life over a single incident or something like that. And
right.
And so there's obviously trade-offs to extremely strict, no exceptions enforcement of things. That, the elementary school shooter, right? He had told a friend that he had showed up and a friend saw that he was cutting himself, or had cuts on his face. He said he did it himself. That friend probably should have intervened in some way, reported it to school officials or whatever might have been the case. But, you're talking about somebody who's also a kid, and putting that responsibility on them.
Yeah.
And it's difficult. It's easy to look back in hindsight and say, well, there's these warning signs. And sometimes they are very bright warning signs.
Right.
They're very red flags. Like Parkland had multiple incidents. A lot of these guys have multiple incidents. And so if somebody at some point would do something it makes sense. But at the same time, it's easy to look back with 20/20 vision and say, well, we know of this one incident that is a warning sign. He should have been committed or arrested or charged on based on this. When in real life, people aren't, often going to be given the harshest punishments for a first offense.
Right.
or a first warning sign does not, because most of the time that doesn't mean that you're going to actually, it's such a small likelihood that somebody who has a particular warning sign is going to actually end up being a mass killer.
Right.
That it's one thing you have to keep in mind is that when you're saying we need to fully prosecute every warning sign or push it to the very most severe reaction to every red flag or warning sign, you're talking about doing that to millions of people who are not going to end up committing any kind of violent crime, let alone a mass killing. So this is one of the things that I think people have to keep in mind. There's trade-offs to all of this. But I don't know. I don't want to get too pessimistic about it, right? And say there's not. I don't like saying there's nothing that can be done, or these are inevitable, or there's no way we could reduce this. I just want people to understand that it's not. There isn't one magic trick like you see in the viral ads, right?
Yeah.
That's just going to fix all this. There's trade-offs to all of these things.
And
and you have to be able to understand those trade-offs and make the calculation of whether or not you're willing to make those trade-offs. I guess is my point.
I think that's a huge point, because he brings up, for example, things like the Charleston or the San Antonio shooting, or even Parkland that you brought up, where, there's recurring indicators in these people's past. In the cases of Charleston and San Antonio, there were actual disqualifying according to the 4473 events that happened in this past. But in order to make sure that, that safety net catches those disqualifying events, you would have to be willing to enable a lot more law enforcement sharing of information, much more bureaucratic sharing of information. And, that it's kind of interesting how this can kind of cross-cut different ways politically, where folks who may not be so keen on maybe boosting law enforcement's ability to monitor more things are also looking for more solutions to stop these mass shootings. And so the trade-offs thing is key here, where you have to weigh the interests. Do we think this is going to help prevent these shootings? Are we willing to give up, privacy or whatever your concern may be, in order to make that happen? So that's why he asked if there's any efforts that we've seen. You see it get talked about, but I don't think there's been any real effort, because these trade-offs are hard, as you said. And we, like you said, we don't want to be pessimistic, but these are real trade-offs to consider.
Yeah.
And that's why we are where we are.
Yeah. I mean, I wish there was an easy solution to everything, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all wish there was, and that's why people gravitate towards somebody telling them there is an easy solution, right? Just ban all the guns. Well, look, even if you banned all new gun sales tomorrow, you still have so many firearms in the United States that it's not going to, trying to use ban all guns as a solution to mass shootings is, the most broad possible policy you could come up with. Just make sure no one can own guns, because there are a very small number of people who will carry out, a sort of a mass attack like this with them. Of course, we still see mass killings, even mass shootings in other countries that have total gun bans. This is not something that never happens anywhere else, as much as that, might be a talking point. You do see these events all over the world. Whether they're more frequent in the United States is obviously something that is potentially the case, but there's also been dispute. There's was 2018 study that concluded they aren't more frequent in the United States. And these are rare events statistically. Of course, nobody wants to hear that in the immediate aftermath of 19 children being murdered, because everyone cares more about never having it happen at all. But and which is an absolutely reasonable response to a slaughter like that, and makes it difficult to. That's the thing, is the natural, understandable response to something like this is very emotional, because it's such a horrific event. But and so it makes it difficult to say, well, let's step back and look at the statistics on this, right? This is actually fairly rare. It's only the third, mass shooting of the year, or where for mass shooting being 4 more people killed in a single incident like this. But it's that's not going to win over a lot of people when you start talking about it, just because this is such a horrible event that everyone wants it to be 0 times. And so people are willing to consider all sorts of solutions, and they're willing to listen to people who will tell them that there's an easy fix, even if there isn't.
Yeah.
And so that's I think that's perhaps the driving point of my whole overarching thought here that I keep coming back to, I suppose, is just there are things that can be done. I believe that there are things that can be done to reduce the number of these events and try and stop people who show warning signs that they're going to happen, that they're going to carry something like this out. But I just don't. I just go back to like there isn't going to be one single thing that fixes everything. Maybe the single entry is a smart policy for school safety, and I know that schools use it. Maybe arming teachers who want to be armed, if they've gone through the proper training, is a good idea. I've done the armed teacher training course, part of it in Colorado. You know, teaching police to respond properly to these events. We're hearing now that they waited between 40 minutes and an hour before they went in after this shooter, which is insane. Given what we've known since Columbine,
Right.
you know, the parents urged them to go in, and they didn't for some reason. It's not clear why that things happen that way. As eerily similar to Parkland and Columbine, sadly. But you know, so you could that better training for police, better understanding of what to actually do in a situation like this is something that can help. But not, you know, red flag laws might be another solution. You know, you could certainly, you saw Florida take the approach of limiting the age of ownership for basically AR-15s and similar firearms. You might even see Texas do something like that. I'm sure New York probably will. I think you're going to write a piece looking at those possibilities. Who knows? Maybe that has an effect. I don't know that it will, but you know, you can point to any number of mass shootings where the weapon was not an AR-15, and just restricting the ownership of a particular style of rifle is probably not going to be something that actually solves the problem, even if it was the rifle that has been used in a number of high-profile mass shootings. But yeah, I just keep going back to this idea that you're not going to get one policy that's going to fix all of this. And some of it's beyond, you know, policy making, like we talked about with the social factors at play. But all right, I've made a little bit of a rambling rant there, but let's go on to the next question here. This one's from Nathan, who's very articulate. He's got a great vocabulary here, but he asks, given the dichotomy between fevered political lobbying in the immediate wake of a crisis and likewise rapid retrospectives demonstrating systemic and legal inefficiency, how can we as a society, and you, as in me and you, Jake, as media, have metered and rational analysis while still mitigating the impact of the resulting media contagion? So let me just give people the concept of media contagion here. There is a theory that mass shootings happen in clusters, as we've seen with these most recent ones. And that part of the motivation there involves media attention on the shooters themselves. That talking more about the shootings and the shooters can actually inspire other people to carry out similar attacks. And so he's saying, like, how can you cover this, have rational conversation about what's going on, and look at policy effects or solutions to the problem without increasing the likelihood that it's going to inspire somebody else to do the same thing. We had a while back last year, I had Professor James Allen Fox from Northwestern University on, who he tracks mass shootings for the Associated Press and for Northwestern. And, contagion theory, I will say, is at least somewhat controversial concept. That sort of raising the awareness of the fact that somebody can carry out an attack like this makes people who are vulnerable to do so more likely to actually follow through on their desire or their thought of committing a mass killing. And some people connect this with the impulse to this is basically like a suicidal impulse, but where somebody doesn't have there's a strong shame culture against suicide, and so instead they carry out some horrific attack that's likely to result in their death. This is one of the theories for why these things happen. And so the more somebody in that state of mind sees that somebody else has done this, the more likely they are to do it themselves. That's the concept. James Allen Fox was dismissive of this idea. And the idea that mass shootings are clustered together. His claim is that it isn't necessarily true. That sometimes these events might happen in quick succession, but if you look at the long history of mass shootings, you don't actually see much correlation in terms of the timing of them. Right. So, other people, there have been studies that show there is an effect. So it's a open question. There's a lot of obviously open questions about mass shootings because they're shocking, but they're also statistically rare form of gun violence in the United States. They make up a very small percentage of the number of people killed in the country each year. But I don't know. It's a good question. If you believe in contagion theory, how do you talk about this responsibly without contributing to the problem itself?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing you can do is avoid notoriety for the shooter as much as possible.
Yeah.
I've made it a policy here to only name a shooter when absolutely necessary for the story.
Yeah.
So basically, in the immediate aftermath, when look, we don't cover mass shootings as they break most of the time because we're a very small outlet who focuses on national gun policy, and everybody covers mass shootings. There's not really generally much we can add to the coverage in the vast majority of situations. But otherwise, when we're talking about mass shooters, we prefer not to name them. I don't find a very good reason to name a mass shooter in reporting beyond the very basic initial reporting about who the suspect was, or trying to get information about their background and so forth. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Jake?
Yeah, I was going to say this comes back to a similar cultural and society thing, which is tough to have a silver bullet solution for, because it just takes individual agency to make that concerted effort to not avoid over glorifying the shooter by digging into all these extraneous details. You saw a lot of really bizarre rumors being spread about who the shooter was on social media. I'm not really going to get into it just because it was totally bunk, but basically avoiding that impulse is what's going to be necessary, because that only drives so much more focus on things that don't matter. And as you said, you want metered and rational analysis. And I hope that we've come across as trying to do that in cases like this, where this is obviously a complicated scenario that requires really thoughtful, measured response. That's another thing, is just lead by example, do your part. Don't contribute to the mayhem that inevitably will happen to a certain extent. And that's really all you can do, is just do your part, and don't reward people that do it the other way, essentially, but with your intention, with your clicks, with your engagement. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah. And I mean, I honestly don't know if not naming the shooters helps or not. I don't know if, the fame gained by these these people is a motivating factor. Sometimes you'll get some shooters that say it is. Of course, what shooters say about why they do things should also be questioned, of course. There's the Buffalo shooter, for instance, talked about specifically targeting a town in New York because of the loose gun laws, right? Which is a common point you hear on the right about, or in the gun owning community about mass shootings, that they target soft targets, right? But then he also targeted a store that had an armed security guard, which he knew. So there's a lot of contradictions. And then you read through his ramblings, which I did usually I do not, but I did in that case to understand how he had modified his gun, because there was a lot of reporting on that, and I wanted to actually understand what it was, because the reporting wasn't very clear on what he had done. But you can see all sorts of contradictory nonsense in there. That's a lot of it was just copy and pasted from other manifestos or online ramblings. There's a lot of racist memes from 4chan and so forth. Like oftentimes what a shooter wants you to believe about why they're doing something isn't necessarily actually getting at the core of why they did something. It's just, but anyway, I prefer to err on the side of caution, to not give the person any more notoriety than they deserve, which is of course none. So only when it's absolutely necessary to a story will we name one of these shooters. So whether that helps prevent other shootings, I don't know, but I don't see a good journalistic reason beyond the initial phase to name these people and potentially contribute to their infamy or their fame. So that's why we have that policy. But all right, next question here. And this is Doug Jefferson again from the National African American Gun Association. And he asks, what effect, if any, do you think the recent mass shootings will have on the Supreme Court case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin? This is the major gun carry case that the Supreme Court is considering right now, whose opinion we're expecting in any day. Really could be Monday. It wasn't this Monday. They announced their opinions on Monday, and when they're in session, which is what they're doing now. So it could certainly be Monday. I don't know how things work at the court. If they,
I was going to say I don't know that it affects the decision. Maybe they'll push the release of it maybe a week or two just to kind of get it out of the, because judges are human. So but in terms of the decision, I don't. This is pure speculation, obviously, because I'm not in the room with these decision makers, but I don't think it necessarily affects the decision at all.
And so that it's hard to know what's going on inside the Supreme Court, because it's generally speaking a very tight-lipped place.
No one leaked anything to us. So
I mean, obviously that's changed a little bit with the abortion ruling that got leaked, but. We certainly they could move when they would release this. I would think that they would want to move it, not do it Monday, given the circumstances in the country. I don't know that it'll have any impact on the outcome of the case. I mean, certainly this case didn't have anything to do with what happened in the Buffalo or the Texas shootings. They didn't involve gun carry. It wasn't a question of, whether or not these attackers had concealed carry licenses or whatever. So the legal question is not really relevant to the events, but obviously it's gun related, Second Amendment related, and it's going to be controversial because of that, regardless of what the outcome is. And I don't know that the court wants to. I'd be surprised if the court released it on Monday. Maybe they'll wait a week or 2 weeks or whatever, just to get some distance from this horrific event, and so that they're not creating new controversy around it immediately. So that's the effect I could see it having, like you said. All right. Now let's move on to a little bit of NRA related questions. There's some of our NRA related questions that we've gotten.
Sure.
This one comes from a Reload member named Christy. And she asks, we know the NRA is in turmoil, but unless readers and listeners have actually tried to work with their standard service divisions in the last year, whether it's membership, education, competitions, clubs, they may not realize how decimated the staff and services have truly become. These are all divisions that historically have played a role in supporting a robust and engaged pro-Second Amendment culture between major political fights. With these services unraveling, membership dropping, and staff who spent their time focusing on engaging the grassroots gun rights community ousted in the last few years, where do you see NRA's place in helping to mobilize any grassroots political response to new gun control proposals after these high-profile shootings? That's a really good question.
It is, yeah.
Because she's right. The NRA has cut staff dramatically. Now, most of that came during the pandemic, where they laid off hundreds of people, but they haven't rehired most of those people. And so it is in a practical sense, a much smaller organization than it used to be. Obviously we had that internal financial report that we published last year that showed their revenues and spending are both half of what they used to be in 2018. And so the organization is struggling significantly and their membership has fallen significantly. And given the fact that they have cut a lot of the services that members really value from the NRA, it's hard to see how they're going to climb out of that hole very quickly or easily, especially with the New York case still pending over their head, which very well could result in not only the ouster of their leadership and Wayne LaPierre and other members of NRA leadership, but could also see a court-appointed overseer at the end of it. Those are very likely outcomes for that case. It's not inevitable or the only possible outcomes, but they're highly likely. So it's hard to see how they're going to be able to re-engage people and grow again. But I will say, so certainly that has an impact on their ability to mobilize people at the grassroots level. Like the NRA's ability to mobilize people is impacted. But what I will say is that the NRA is also going to benefit from the fact that they are the shorthand for gun owners in politics in America.
Right.
And so instead of the NRA mobilizing people, gun owners and grassroots pushback to potential new gun regulations, it'll probably be the other way around, where gun owners are going to be motivated to join the NRA because of those things. And one thing I would look for is whether or not the NRA announces substantial new membership signups, because that's going to be significant to probably giving you a really good metric on how far gone the organization really is.
Yeah.
If they do not see a significant surge in membership in the coming month or two, as these fights play out at the state and federal level over what to do about these horrific shootings, then that could tell you a lot about how gun owners perceive the NRA now, and would be, if they do not receive hundreds of thousands of new members, that's a sign that they may never fully recover.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I don't have a ton to add to that, because I think that is the key. We've obtained financial documents in the past and done some in-depth reporting on it. And what you see is, obviously election years are big, but also years that coincide with high profile mass shootings, you see spikes in their membership numbers. But over the last few years, that's also coincided with scandals, very public scandals, a lot of distrust in the gun community. So I think that's going to be the big indicator here, is if we're heading into a midterm election year plus 2 really high profile mass shootings. And if that doesn't galvanize support for the NRA, that's kind of a big indication of where they're at.
Yeah. I mean, they should have been gaining members the last 2 years because of the surge in new gun ownership, and they haven't.
Right.
But now, this is a moment where guns are going to be at the center of politics, and there's going to be a significant push to pass new gun legislation at the state and federal level. And if that doesn't increase their roles, then I don't know what ever would. You know what I mean? That's just from a practical standpoint, like that. This is what people join the NRA for, and if they're not joining it after this event, and given the kind of political pushback that's going to happen, the kind of political push for gun restrictions, then how does the NRA? How can anyone justify the idea that they're going to rebound and grow again?
Yeah.
At least not without a massive shift in the organization, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what you'd want to look for, and the NRA, if it's happening, the NRA, sorry, if it happens, if they do grow, if they do get a lot of new members, the NRA will tell everyone. It's not going to be a secret.
Oh yeah.
If they don't say anything, that's when you know,
right,
that they're not growing. Mm-hmm. Okay. The next 2 questions here. Christy has a follow-up, and then Cody Claxton has a question. They're somewhat related, so we'll try to tackle them together here. So Cody says, to be more effective at firearms rights lobbying, wouldn't it make sense to pull together the gun rights groups into a coalition to be more effective and coordinate talking points and focus? And then, so he's talking about groups like Firearms Policy Coalition, Gun Owners of America, VCDL, Virginia Citizens Defense League, the Crime Research Center. And then he also asked, what's the future of NRA Institute for Legislative Action? Can it be reorganized into another organization? And then Christie's question is about the rise of non-NRA groups, those same sort of groups that Cody mentioned. As well as some non-political groups like Steel Challenge, to fill the void left behind by the NRA shrinking. Right. So I guess should the smaller gun groups try to work together in order to replace or fill the gap left behind by the NRA? Sorry, by the NRA's recent shrinking, I guess. And is that even possible? Are they big enough to replace the NRA, or at least fill in what's been lost recently? It's a good question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, we kind of discussed about this a little bit, because you see this tend to come up from time to time whenever there's a new story about something going on at the NRA. Just the thing is, these groups are active, and a lot of them are growing in their presence. There's just no one yet that can match the behemoth that is the NRA at its peak. A lot of these groups do a lot of work. They're very active, especially in litigation, but no one matches the NRA's combination of litigation, education, outreach, competition, gun, the museum that they operate. They're just ubiquitous in the firearm space, where a lot of these groups tend to be much more specialty groups, much smaller donation wise in terms of the revenue that they take in. So, I mean, as of right now, there's just not a model yet, I think, to replace the NRA.
Yeah. I think that's the bottom line, that I think a lot of people don't even really understand this fully. The NRA at its peak was a $400 million organization.
Yeah.
Most of these other groups that we've mentioned there, and they've been growing, so we'll reserve some judgment. Yeah. We haven't seen their 2021 tax filings that would indicate how big they are, but most of them aren't breaking into the 7-figure, or sorry, 8. Most of them aren't breaking into the 8-figure mark. So most of them are under $10 million a year organizations, or have been historically. And then, none of them that I'm aware of break like $20 million in revenue per year in any of the filings I've ever seen for these groups. So they're really not comparable in size. And the staff wise, they're nowhere near. The NRA was a 500 person organization in terms of staff. And then of course you have membership, and nobody comes anywhere near the NRA in terms of membership. Nobody's in terms of dues paying members, people who pay you to be part of the organization, nobody comes anywhere near the 5 million. What was the peak they had? I think in the document that we found, it was like 5.25 or something.
Right. Yeah, it's over 5 million.
Over 5 million, but it was never near 6, despite some of the claims the NRA had made. But that no one else is probably even near 1 million, even close. And that includes organizations on the other side of the issue too. Everytown or March for Our Lives or whatever. None of them have.
No, that's right.
Have the size that the NRA has. And the scope is also another issue. Like Second Amendment Foundation or FPC have done a lot of legal work in the Second Amendment space. Sometimes the NRA has even taken credit or tried to take credit for the cases that they've won, the Second Amendment Foundation in particular. But that's like their main thing.
Right.
They don't really have neither of them have a built out network of instructors, for instance, or competition shooting or youth shooting programs or anything remotely like that. Most of them, they don't have lobbying campaigns that are nationwide in every state, right? GOA has started to do a little more in terms of actual state level lobbying, but even still, they're in a limited number of states,
right?
And historically weren't doing as much on that front, and they're doing legal suits as well. But nobody comes anywhere close to matching the NRA, even with the growth that they've seen in recent years. And so it's difficult to see them with the NRA still around and still bringing in, $200 million a year, whatever it might be these days. It's unlikely that any other group is going to rise up to match that level because they still have to compete with the NRA for most of the money. And the NRA is still probably several times larger than all these other groups combined. And so that's one thing that I think a lot of people miss about the NRA situation. You see people who are critical of the NRA and critical of the corruption and, perhaps are convinced that there's no way that they can help fix the problems through the internal reform efforts. A lot of them just kind of give up on the organization and say, well, I'll join one of these other organizations and the NRA is useless and doesn't matter. That's not true. I mean, unfortunately for people who hold that position, it's just not the case.
Right.
The NRA, there was a lot of corruption that's already been admitted to, frankly, to millions of dollars worth of funds being misappropriated, and the allegations are for tens of millions more. But that graft was happening on top of an organization that legitimately was doing a lot of significant work and still does, frankly. To be honest, it's not that the NRA doesn't do anything anymore either. So, but could a coalition of all these groups come together and reach some level of effectiveness that the former NRA had, 5 years ago or whatever?
Right.
Maybe.
The problem there is that a lot of them are litigation specialists. And so you're just you're asking 7 different litigation organizations to form one. Whereas, as we just talked about, the scope of the NRA's operations include litigation, but go so far beyond that. That's why I think it's not as plausible for these other prominent groups that you're probably aware of to join forces. They collaborate on lawsuits all the time. You see that happen pretty
lawsuits,
regularly.
absolutely.
But you're not branching off to form, we'll be the training component, and we'll be the litigation shop,
Right.
and we'll be the lobbying arm, and
There's nothing like that going on. Yeah.
Right.
So no, I don't think that if the NRA went away completely tomorrow, yeah, my guess is that something would spring up in its place.
Yeah.
And maybe it would be a mixture of a number of groups, but that's not the reality of today.
Yeah.
And it's not likely, the NRA is not likely to go away anytime soon, even if Wayne LaPierre got removed and the New York case went completely against them. It's unlikely that they would end as an organization, although they are burning money and making cuts to services at a pretty unsustainable rate. But yeah, I mean, and I think it's also, even with these other groups doing a lot of good litigation and having success. I think FPC and SAF just had a successful case in California about the age restrictions on long guns there, or on the AR-15 style firearms, which is going to be very relevant moving forward in the aftermath of these shootings. But the NRA's, that Supreme Court case, that's an NRA case. That's
right.
One of their state affiliates, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association. That's an NRA case. So. They're not gone. They are weakened. They're not, but none of these groups are in a position to fully replace them. And I don't know that any of them would even claim to be in a position to do that. I mean, but I think, again, it goes back to like, the NRA is a powerful and significant organization, but they're not the be all and end all when it comes to gun ownership in America. So even if they don't see that rebound in membership and increase in influence that they would normally see when there's big pushes for new gun control, it's not clear to me that new gun control, especially at the federal level, is actually going to succeed anyway. Because, I mean, Tester Tester from Montana, Manchin from West Virginia, King from Maine, it's not the NRA. It's not like some fealty to the NRA that they're showing when they oppose strict new gun control bills. It's the fact that they have a lot of constituents who oppose these ideas. Whether or not they're NRA members is a secondary question.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to underplay the NRA's influence or whatever, but it's gun owners' influence is beyond what the NRA's is.
That's absolutely right.
As much as they've become the shorthand for gun owners in America, like, the reality is, even when they are politically weakened, it doesn't necessarily mean that gun owners are politically weakened overall. But I mean, that makes sense to you, Jake?
Yeah, no, that's the gist of it. And I think that's also a good point to hit on the fact that the NRA isn't a stand-in for all gun owners writ large, because you do see that every single time. So it's worth reemphasizing that point. But
that is all the questions we have for this week. We really appreciate you guys, our members, sending in some very smart questions, honestly, some very thought-provoking stuff in there. Hopefully we've done a good job in responding to them in the best way possible. But I think that's it for this week. If you want to become a member, you should head on over to the Reload. Actually, we're going to be doing a Memorial Day sale. So you can get a 20% off on a membership. We don't do these sales very often. So, make sure you take advantage of that opportunity. We haven't had a sale in, since last year, I think. So, they don't come around very often. Make sure you grab up a membership at a discount while you can. But we really appreciate you guys tuning in. If you've made it this far in the episode, I would really love to ask you to share the show with anyone you think might be interested, and to leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever app you're listening to us on, or give us a thumbs up and subscribe on YouTube as well, where you can watch the show if you want to see our faces during this conversation. But that's it for this week. We will see you guys again next week.